Can you imagine that 4 out of 10 placentas that were examined were found to have spike protein in it? Not the virus, just spike protein. Why in the world is no one talking about this? This is such an important piece of information. And why is it taking so long for it to appear? When we look at this paper that was just recently published about the detection of spike protein in term placentas of COVID vaccinated and or infected women, this was done in Germany. But what you have to look at carefully here is that it was received in July of 2025. That was when they submitted this paper. But they were looking at women in the period of 2022. Now, maybe they looked at this in the context of a few years. Maybe they decided to do the research in 2024. But these are such important questions that it is baffling that this kind of research was not done earlier, especially when it was recommended by almost all agencies across the world that there are no concerns. Now, one of the interesting things is that when they looked at the paper, they did find that they didn't see any issues with fetal malformations or problems with the pregnancy or even loss of pregnancies looking at this cohort. It wasn't a big cohort. It was about 106 women. But the point is that what I'm going to be showing you is what this means in the longer term and why this should not be ignored. I have access to data when I can analyze hospital admission statistics. And if you know what to look for, you will find the patterns if you understand what happens with the spike protein. And this is the bit that many people don't get. The spike protein dysregulates the immune system. And guess what? There is a condition in the context of pregnancy, which is pre-eclampsia, that is like an immune disorder. This is really, really important point because an infant or a neonate or the fetus, is a completely different organism. Its genetic setup is different from the mother. And so the immune system has to learn how to not destroy this foreign creature or baby in the womb. And so there is a very tight balance with the immune system. And what I'm going to be showing you is that it seems that the immune system is affected with regards to spike protein. So a few simple things before we get into the paper, because what I'm going to be showing you is what I think is relevant longer term. We have here two placentas. On the left is a healthy placenta. On the right is a placenta with pre-eclampsia. Now, this represents the umbilical cord, and this is what carries the blood to the fetus. So remember, the baby has no oxygen, so it needs to get the oxygen and nutrients from the mother. That's the purpose of the placenta. And so these here represent blood vessels from the mother, spiral arteries, that will then meet with the blood supply from the fetus. But they have to be separate. They don't make any contact with each other directly because the immune system from the mother could then attack the fetus. What you notice in preeclampsia is that these spiral arteries are much smaller than a normal healthy pregnancy. And I'm not an obstetrician, but my basic premise of physiology would be, in order to get the blood supply, therefore, to this placenta that has smaller arteries, the blood supply or the blood pressure in the mother has to increase. And so if you have a rise in preeclampsia, you would expect, therefore, that if the blood supply to the placenta is reduced, the mother has to increase the blood pressure in order to get adequate oxygen to the fetus. Okay? So this is the basic premise that I'm talking about, very simplified. about the relevance of preeclampsia in the context of what we're looking at. So the first thing is, let's look at the paper and see what they found. So when they looked at this cohort of the women, 106 women, this was in one center between November 2020 and October 2022. So it had a proportion who were unvaccinated at the time. And they then took the placenta and they looked specifically for SARS-CoV-2 spike and nucleocapsid proteins. So you have to remember the spike is the entry protein. The nucleocapsid proteins are inside the viral envelope, and this usually suggests infection. So they recognize that 87% of these women were at least had one vaccine dose. And they found that the spike positive cells in the placenta were predominantly Hofbauer cells and trophoblasts. Now, what's important about this is that these cells are immune cells on the fetal side of the blood supply. Now, remember again, just the basic premises here, that when we look at the blood supply, the mother is the one who would have had COVID and was vaccinated. And so therefore, the spike protein, if it got in the bloodstream, would be on the mother's side. What they found was that primarily the spike protein was on the fetal side. What it means is that it crossed this barrier and ended up on the inside, on the other side of this barrier of the placenta. It was picked up by the immune cell there, and this is where it sits. So we don't know if when it crossed, it could have circulated in terms of the fetus, but we do know that it definitely crossed. And so this is the first very important point that we have to try and understand. It does cross, and we knew this before. And one interesting thing that they highlighted in the paper is that they did not find viral RNA in the investigated sample. So they were looking to see, was this infection or was this spike protein? And so it seems that there was no active infection in the placenta. This was likely to be circulation of spike protein in the mother. What we call exosomes is one of the examples where the body has vesicles and it shares them around if it's having a problem with them. And these little vesicles, these little balloons, can have packed in them RNA, DNA, proteins, and in some cases, spike protein. And it's one of the efficient ways that the body can share things around. These little packages, in theory, can cross this mother-fetus barrier in the placenta. And this may be one of the mechanisms as to how the spike protein got on the fetal side. And as they pointed out in their discussion, these findings may suggest a potential for transplacental transfer of spike protein or cellular uptake. However, they don't know the significance of these mechanisms. And this is highlighting how little we know so far. After 6 years, you would think that by now all of these things would be front and center, being investigated, being understood, lots of autopsies. The beauty about this, finally, at least they're doing histology and not just doing some computer modeling to try and tell us how wonderful everything had been. We need data. And this is a good example of the kind of data that was done. Here you had the breakdown in terms of the type of vaccines that were used. And it was primarily the Pfizer vaccine that was used for first and second injection. One person in 2022 had the fourth injection. And you can see that these numbers here during the pregnancy, COVID-19 during the pregnancy, you can see that 29 of the 71 had COVID during the pregnancy with the Pfizer. and the same after the second injection. So you can see a lot of people were still getting infected in the context of being vaccinated. So they were vaccinated, then they got infected. In my view, that represents a cumulative exposure to spike protein. Because if spike protein, whatever the source, gets across and into the immune system, it can cause problems. Useful information here with regards to the kinds of symptoms that they had. Interestingly, most of them, very few had pneumonia, none. Some had fever. The most common symptom was nasal congestion, and second in line was a sore throat. Third in line was a cough. You can see that a proportion also had gastrointestinal symptoms, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. So again, nice, useful information with regards to what is happening. And again, another piece of information that I found valuable to reflect on is when they compare the vaccinated to the unvaccinated. Even though it was small, you can see that for the vaccinated, nasal congestion is quite common compared to the unvaccinated, so slightly more. Looking across at whether or not there's anything else that stood out much. Diarrhea, nothing really. Sore throat, again, was higher in the vaccinated than it was in the unvaccinated. And these are just useful bits of history that are relevant going forward for what we're doing. Now, the important question was to do with what, where, and what was found with spike protein. And so when you looked in detail at the histology, what they found was that spike protein here, positive samples of the number who had COVID-19, 14 of them had it. What was interesting is these Hofbauer cells, which are immune cells. These are the resident immune cells on the fetal side. And looking across, you can see that in terms of it being positive, this represented the most significant positive finding across infection, vaccination, vaccine plus COVID, vaccine plus respiratory disease. Consistently, this was the highest in terms of a positive signal. That's very important because I know that once spike protein gets into any immune cell, it will dysregulate it. And especially in the context of inflammatory processes, put it in a pro-inflammatory locked state. So this is where I'm taking you now back to what the outcomes will be if the immune system is locked in an immune inflammatory state in the placenta. What diseases can you expect to find? And again, now, this is where I'll take you through just a reminder, what is the mechanism that I'm proposing here? As I said, in a healthy placenta, the spiral arteries from the mother are nice and large. In preeclampsia, they get quite constricted. And this seems to be an immune-vascular problem that can then damage, longer term, the placenta, which can lead to low birth weights, sometimes stillbirths, and so on. But the critical condition is this preeclampsia. Based on the immune system, what I therefore looked for was, did we see any increase in preeclampsia and hypertension beyond the pandemic? That was what I looked for, because I knew that the driving force around the placenta and the way how the immune and vascular department is impacted by ongoing infection and spike protein exposure, I would expect to see an increase. But I did not expect to see this kind of increase. So what I have done is that I'm able to look at the statistics and put together flow charts of the conditions as they are admitted into hospital. And this is what I found when it was put together. This is pre-eclampsia admissions in the UK, ICD 014. Pre-pandemic, 2016, 2017, 18, 18, 19, 2020. You can see that this is pretty stable. 2021, we see an increase. This is 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025. This is going off the scale. I mean, we don't clearly have a good explanation yet. I think it's immune vascular related. And what this is pointing out to me is the COVID storm. Reinfection after immune priming is driving pathology. And this may be one of the best examples that we see about what's happening in pregnancies. This is important stuff. And this really, really should be studied very, very carefully. I shouldn't have to be able to find this. I'm not an obstetrician. And so therefore, I'm just analyzing and using my understanding of COVID to be able to predict where disease trajectory will go. What about hypertension in pregnancy? Look at these numbers. My goodness, it went from 12,000, literally about 11,000 in 2020 to over 23,000 in 2025. This is a 100% increase on a trajectory that is going off the scale. This is a kind of thing that public health should be absolutely focused on. What does this mean? What are the implications? This is very serious pathology that we're starting to see, and it gives us an insight into what is happening across the population. When it comes to, and this is where the point is in terms of placental disorders, again, not a significant a rise, but you see a similar pattern. Rising after 2020, suggesting damage to the placenta. There is a dip here in 2025. I don't know if that's because there were less pregnancies, but overall, this is rising as well. Across the board, placental disorders and hypertension is going off the scale. I'm telling you that whichever way you look at this, this represents public health disaster in a decade, because everybody is sitting and hoping that everything is going to come back to normal. I warn you, ongoing circulation of this virus in a vaccine immune primed population is an absolute disaster, and it will only get worse year on year. Just a reminder as to what happens with the placenta. You can see here, these arteries, these spiral arteries from the mother get constricted. They can't supply as much blood with oxygen to the fetus. The fetus drives signals to then push up the blood pressure. And this is why I expect that hypertension in pregnancy would be increasing off the scale. As I said, the implications, this kind of research should have been done a long time ago. They're finding spike protein in the placenta, and it's in the immune cells in the placenta. It's likely to be driving pathology in pregnancy. In the longer term, they are only looking for fetal malformations and probably stillbirths around the time of vaccination. This is not how this works. This is a far more complex and layered situation. Again, final reminder, just in case you didn't understand the implications of what I'm saying. Pre-eclampsia went from about, say, 10,500 in 2019 to over 16,000 cases, admissions in the UK in 2025. It's horrific for gestational hypertension. Hypertension in pregnancy went from about 11,000 to over almost 23,000, almost 100% increase over the past 5 years. These patterns will continue. And the danger is, even if they accepted it, the reality of it, we may not have been able to mitigate it. But we have absolutely no chance of mitigating this if we don't research it. The pathology and the histology has taken too long. I've been calling for it for 4 years now, and we are only still getting snippets and tidbits. Whoever is responsible for this will have to face the judgment as to why they didn't do more to try and understand the implications of what happened in the pandemic. Thank you very much for watching. Look out for more information in the future. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment.